Clewiston middle school teacher was convicted of selling illegal drugs to students. Prosecutors say Maria Rivera also taught 2 girls how to prepare and use the drugs. She's facing 35 years in prison when she's sentenced next month. The judge did allow her.
Breaking news, FBI and DEA raid teacher's home to a 25-kilogram heroin meth lab and 42M laundered exposed.
Shattered trust at dawn. The heroin bricks stacked inside military duffels, the lined-up rifles, the ammunition marked with cartel insignia, all of it formed a mosaic of choices I once justified as strategic, necessary, inevitable. But confronted by federal flashlights reflecting off metal and glass, those choices suddenly looked grotesque. I had always relied on chemical precision, on quantifiable results, on reaction chains that obeyed the laws of science. Now I was face to face with the only reaction I could never control: consequences. What struck me most in that moment wasn't the fear of arrest. It was the realization that the basement didn't shock me anymore. I had lived inside this 2-tiered existence for so long that the boundary between teacher and trafficker dissolved until I could no longer tell which identity was the disguise. The lab wasn't an aberration, it had become the rhythm of my life, the place where my skills were valued, not for shaping young minds, but for fueling an industrial operation that cared only for profit and control. As agents photographed every corner, I noticed the open logbook on the steel table. 3 years of entries, dates, tonnage, purity levels, calculations scrawled in my handwriting, once praised for its clarity on classroom whiteboards, now preserved as evidence of mass production. I felt an unexpected pang as I watched gloved hands lift the book and slide it into an evidence bag. Not guilt, not denial, but something colder: the recognition that the meticulous order I maintained had trapped me more effectively than any set of handcuffs. When they examined the ventilation system, the reinforced ceiling beams, the modified locks, I finally understood the scale of what they had pieced together. They knew the shipments, they knew the shell companies, they knew the offshore accounts, they even knew the officials who helped clear the routes. The basement was not their revelation, it was their confirmation. And yet, as their radios crackled with updates, one agent paused at the doorway, scanning the lab with a look that lingered just a moment too long. It wasn't admiration or disgust, but something closer to disbelief that I had managed to maintain this operation under the noses of an entire community. In that silent exchange, I confronted the most damning truth of all: I hadn't just manipulated chemistry, I had manipulated people, institutions, trust itself. The basement was no longer a hidden world, it was a confession chamber, and I finally unmasked, could not look away. Money, power, and silent allies. People always imagine criminal empires as chaotic things, dirty cash stuffed into gym bags, frantic calls made in alleyways, desperate men hiding behind tinted windows. But mine was never built on panic. It was built on structure, on knowledge, on the cold discipline that only someone trained to manage systems, budgets, and institutional expectations could weaponize. Standing in that basement as agents uncovered files, receipts, and encrypted devices, I realized the financial world I crafted had grown too vast for even me to fully comprehend anymore. It wasn't a side operation, it was a parallel life organized with the same meticulous care I once devoted to lesson plans and lab instructions. The shell corporations were never meant to be glamorous, just invisible. 23 entities across Nevada, the Cayman Islands, and Panama, each one a silent chamber in a labyrinth designed to keep money moving without ever being seen. I had set them up using the same attention to detail I applied to classroom experiments. One miscalculated variable could collapse everything, but I never miscalculated. Educational grants, STEM initiatives, school partnerships, every legitimate program became a perfect vessel for laundering millions. I took the language of academia, the trust placed in educators, and twisted them into financial instruments that cartels praised far more than any school board ever did. Yet none of this would have survived without the allies who stood quietly in the margins. Some of them never realized they were involved. Others knew exactly what they were doing. A deputy sheriff who needed additional consulting income. A school inspector whose visits always aligned perfectly with shipment windows. A port coordinator who could clear containers without raising an eyebrow. They were not coerced. They simply saw opportunity and convinced themselves it wasn't their responsibility to ask questions. Looking back, I'm still haunted by how easily doors opened for me. People trust educators with an almost sacred reverence. They assume our intentions are pure, noble, unwavering. I exploited that belief with surgical precision. My reputation gave me access to grant committees, community partnerships, and meetings with local law enforcement meetings where the same officers shaking my hand later exchanged encrypted messages about delivery schedules and payoff amounts. Their uniforms represented authority. Their silence represented complicity. I always believed that if a lie was built carefully enough layer by layer, year after year, it could stand forever. But everything I constructed, every illusion I perfected, collapsed in the 15 seconds it took for the federal battering ram to hit my door. Even now, replaying that morning in my mind, I'm haunted by a single question: at what exact moment did I start believing I could outrun the consequences of my own creation? The cold air rushed in before I could breathe, and the lights on the agent's rifle sliced through the dark like accusations made of steel. Their footsteps thundered through my living room, the same living room where students once visited for tutoring sessions, where parents thanked me for being a mentor, where administrators praised my commitment to education. Those memories feel painful now, hollow gestures built on foundations I knew were already rotting beneath me. As the agents flipped through my ledgers that morning, I could tell they understood the real scandal wasn't the money itself. It was how deeply it had seeped into the institutions meant to guard against corruption. Every financial trail they traced exposed another weakness in the system, another person who chose convenience over integrity. I wondered how many of them would deny knowing me, how many would pretend shock when investigators confronted them with their own signatures and approvals. Loyalty is a fragile fiction. Silence is the only real currency. But the most damning evidence came from my encrypted cloud storage. Transportation logs, hostage lists, passport scans, medical notes, the documentation of human beings reduced to items in a ledger. Even I couldn't look at those files without feeling a fracture deep inside. I had crossed lines that no rationalization could justify. What began as a calculated operation had expanded into something unrecognizable, monstrous, sustained by people who believed their part was small enough to excuse. The agents saw the network. The prosecutors would expose it, but I, standing there in the harsh beam of a flashlight, had to confront something far more uncomfortable without the willingness of ordinary officials to look away. None of this would have lasted a single year. Power doesn't corrupt in a vacuum. It spreads through human choices, small, incremental, easier each time. And I had become the epicenter of those choices, the night the empire collapsed. I used to believe that every system, no matter how intricate, no matter how fortified, had a rhythm to it, a pulse, a predictable cycle that could be manipulated if you understood where its weak points lived. But on the night everything fell apart as hundreds of federal agents converged on the port of Tulsa, I realized the rhythm had shifted long before I noticed. What I had interpreted as control was only the quiet before an inevitable collapse. While I watched events unfold through fragmented intelligence updates, another truth crystallized. Empires don't fall from overwhelming force alone. They collapse when the lies supporting them run out of space to breathe. Hours before the first flashbang ignited the sky above, the port surveillance teams tracked the trucks carrying 2.5 tons of narcotics. The shipment had been scheduled with the usual precision, timed with port activity concealed in refrigerated trailers, guarded by traffickers trained to shoot before they questioned. But the federal task force moved faster than anything I had accounted for. By 2 to 10 a.m., the operation was already underway. FBI hostage rescue team, DEA fast units, ICE tactical squads, U.S. Marshals Highway Patrol SWAT. More than 200 agents, a storm gathering with purpose. I replayed later how they described it. The port transformed into a maze of shadows and steel, endless rows of shipping containers rising like tombs in the freezing dark rails, humming faintly under distant freight engines. My network had chosen that place because it represented anonymity, but anonymity becomes a trap when the enemy knows exactly where to look. When the first breaching charge detonated against the warehouse's eastern door at 2:37 a.m., the cartel gunmen reacted with the desperation of people who understood the stakes. Automatic fire cut through the night tracer rounds streaking across the concrete. Agents crouched behind barriers, breath visible as they advanced. Snipers perched on towering storage tanks, picked off rooftop guards one by one. The internal barricades overturned forklifts, stacked chemical drums, makeshift sniper perches, turned the warehouse into a battleground where every step demanded courage or luck, sometimes both. What I felt hearing those accounts was not shock, it was inevitability. For months, I had sensed the tightening pressure, the unusual audits, the disconnected questions from colleagues, the sudden silence from contacts who once responded instantly. That night, as the federal spotlight cut through smoke and chaos, the last illusions disintegrated. I had built something too large, too bold, and too intertwined with institutions to remain hidden forever. Inside the warehouse, the agents fought through winding metal catwalks past shadows where cartel fighters fired in controlled bursts. Each flashbang rattled the rafters, giving tactical teams mere seconds to advance. On the southern side, ICE units intercepted traffickers attempting to force the hostages onto a refrigerated truck. 15 lives my operation had endangered without hesitation. A K-9 unit brought down a gunman before he could reload. The violence was swift, unforgiving, and precise. But the detail that haunted me most came from the final moments. When agents reached the container listed in my encrypted files, they cut the lock and opened the doors to reveal terrified faces, 15 people shivering in the cold, bound but alive. That image spread through every federal briefing afterward. It became the symbol of my empire's collapse, a snapshot of lives reduced to footnotes in a larger machinery of profit. I had crafted an identity so convincing that sometimes I believed it myself. A teacher respected by parents, admired by colleagues, trusted by a community that saw me as proof that good educators still existed. But trust is the easiest currency to counterfeit when you know exactly how people want to see you. And I used that understanding more skillfully than any textbook or lesson plan I ever held. As dawn broke and the frost glimmered on the container roofs, the port stood silent except for the hum of generators and the crackle of radios. 2.5 tons of narcotics seized, dozens of weapons recovered, a network of traffickers arrested. And in that silence, I finally understood the cost of what I had built. My operation had not simply been exposed, it had been dissected piece by piece until nothing remained but evidence. The empire that once operated with terrifying precision had crumbled in a single night, and I, its architect, had no power left to reclaim even a fragment of it. Fallout, revelations, and reckoning. When the sun finally rose the morning after the raid, its light did not bring clarity. It exposed the full extent of what had unraveled. I sat in a federal holding room, wrists raw from hours of restraints, as agents sifted through the evidence taken from my home, my accounts, my encrypted files. Every new folder placed on the metal table felt like another layer of my identity being peeled away. But the real collapse didn't happen in that room. It unfolded miles away across Tulsa, where institutions scrambled to understand how someone like me had threaded corruption so deeply into their walls without triggering alarms sooner. Union High School convened an emergency meeting before dawn. Administrators reviewed grants I once championed, programs I insisted on managing, partnerships I encouraged them to approve. My colleagues, people who once praised my dedication, sat stunned as auditors traced millions of laundered dollars through initiatives they had proudly promoted. Parents who once trusted me with their children's education demanded answers none of the officials could provide. I learned later that district offices echoed with disbelief, shame, and outrage, not just at me, but at themselves for never questioning why a teacher with my workload held such effortless influence over budgets and committees. Meanwhile, port authorities faced their own reckoning. The discovery that a logistics coordinator, one of their own, had greenlit uninspected containers for years triggered internal audits that reached every department. Some employees claimed ignorance, others quietly resigned. The city government issued statements expressing shock, promising transparency, vowing reform. But for many residents, those words rang hollow. Their faith had been shaken, not by my crimes alone, but by the realization that so many layers of oversight had failed simultaneously. The federal indictments began rolling out within days. 25 individuals, cartel enforcers, traffickers, financial intermediaries, and most devastatingly public employees were named alongside me. I watched the announcement on a small screen in the detention center, listening as prosecutors detailed the financial networks, the shell corporations, the human trafficking logs, and the operational threads connecting everything. Hearing my name listed with theirs felt surreal, as though they were describing a character I once created and gradually lost control over. Yet the community's reaction was the part that pierced deepest. Parents who had hugged me after school performances now confessed they felt betrayed in a way that went beyond anger. Students I once mentored asked why someone who taught them about ethics, responsibility, and scientific integrity could orchestrate something so destructive. I didn't have an answer even in my own mind. Perhaps the most painful truth was acknowledging that at some point I stopped seeing the harm I caused. I became absorbed in the architecture of the operation, the complexity of the system, the thrill of of control. The human cost became abstract until those 15 hostages were found in that container, until their faces forced me to confront the lives distorted by my decisions. In the silence of my cell, I replayed every moment that had led to this reckoning. The small rationalizations, the gradual moral erosion, the confidence that I could balance both worlds indefinitely. But dual lives always collapse. One inevitably consumes the other. And in my case, the one beneath the basement consumed everything above it. Still, a question lingers. A question I know the community wrestles with as well. How many others knew pieces of the truth, but chose not to look deeper? Could this network have thrived if even one person had challenged the inconsistencies? Corruption rarely grows in isolation. It thrives in the spaces where accountability is assumed instead of enforced. Now facing years of prosecution and a future defined by consequences, I can no longer escape. I am left with only reflection. The institutions I infiltrated are rebuilding, investigations continue, reforms are promised, but whether trust can truly be restored remains uncertain. As the agents moved deeper into my house, past the framed science fair photos and the mug on the counter with my school's logo, I watched their gloved hands sweep across surfaces touched by years of pretense. They were not just searching for evidence, they were dismantling the story I had curated so meticulously that it became indistinguishable from my daily life. The truth, though, was waiting in the basement, humming quietly behind industrial ventilation hoods, far louder in guilt than in sound. For years, that basement existed as the border between who the world thought I was and who I chose to be. Every step down those narrow stairs was a step away from the identity the community loved and toward the one the cartels valued. As I wait for the next hearing, I ask myself and anyone listening one final question: when a system designed to protect can be so easily manipulated, what responsibility do we each hold to ensure it never happens again? What shocked me most that morning was not the force of the raid, it was the realization that the illusion had never fooled those who mattered most. The federal dossier on me had grown thicker for years, each small oversight another thread pulling at the seams of my second life. They had known, they had waited, they had watched the pattern form until it became undeniable, and when they struck without hesitation. Yet even in those chaotic moments, another thought cut through the panic. Would the public ever understand how someone like me, someone standing at the front of a classroom with chalk dust on her sleeves, could become the architect of a criminal empire? Or would they cling to the safer belief that evil always looks like a villain, never like a mentor, never like a teacher? As the cuffs tightened around my wrists, I realized that every secret I kept would soon be laid bare. The raid wasn't just the end of my deception, it was the beginning of everyone else confronting the truth they never bothered to question. And maybe that's the most terrifying part, not that I fooled them, but that they wanted to be fooled. Because believing in the mask was easier than acknowledging what might be hiding behind it. The basement truth uncovered. When the agents pushed me toward the basement door, the cold metal of their grip bit into my arms, but it was the weight of my own memories that made my steps falter. That narrow staircase had always been the threshold between the world I pretended to inhabit and the empire I built beneath it. Each creaking step felt like a confession echoing through the dim air. As they forced me downward, I wondered whether they sensed the shift in atmosphere, the chemical heat, the faint vibration from the vent hoods, the smell that even bleach could never fully erase. They were entering the heart of everything I had hidden, the place where the truth was too large, too loud, too dangerous to coexist with the life upstairs. When the basement lights flicked on, the agents didn't gasp or step back in disbelief. They simply moved with tight precision as though they had already mapped the entire layout in their minds. That quiet confidence terrified me more than any weapon. It meant they had expected exactly what they found: the rows of glassware, the burners arranged with scientific discipline, the digital scales still blinking from the last run I never had the chance to finish. Every beaker, every hose, every crate was a monument to a double life meticulously maintained over years.